Hey there, everyone. Okay, we are going to talk about how to make a pretty simple design that works out to be kind of like a coloring book. In my 2D design class, we often work this way with the idea that these can turn into oil paintings, acrylic paintings, watercolor paintings, a design that would go on the side of a ceramic mug, a pattern if for fashion design, like that this is kind of the beginning of image making, and then that these image can become other things. We're going to use really simple household items today since we're working remotely. In my class, we often use Micron pens, we'll use Faber-Castell markers, we use Posca paint markers, and different things like that, trying to just keep it simple before we get into color theory down the road with paint. But we are going to kind of walk through the steps really quickly of how we're all going to make something similar to this and all the other examples that we've seen today in the presentation. So I asked you guys to see if you could find some images that you print or found in magazines that were engaging to you. So I had been thinking about wanting to make some images from this day that I had spent with my children a few years ago in the Bluebonnets. But I thought for the sake of the time frame today that I wasn't going to make a drawing of a person, which you can, which would be totally fine. I was going to simplify it, and that I wanted to maybe do something a little more abstracted with the flower. So I zoomed in from these images and kind of broke down and found some bluebonnets that I was interested in. I went ahead, I did some visual research on Google, and I found some images there, which I won't use, but your students can. In the classroom, we can use Google Images because of the academic setting, but they can also use Google Images for sale later if they go to the Creative Commons in the search tab, which this one is. This is the one I'm going to use. And then I also found pattern and shape and different things in some of these other photos that I thought were interesting, which I'll talk about those in just a second. In the classroom, you can use things like a magazine and have your students just flip through, put a time frame on it, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and just pick out images that they're interested. They can tear them out of the magazine if that's okay with you. I thought these were pretty. I liked the overall vibe because of the color. Even though we're not doing color, it's still just the image caught my attention. I thought this image was pretty just with the florals, and I like this image. I thought these columns might be fun. So have your students just spend some time looking for different shapes and so forth, different things that are interesting. Then once they've chosen their image, you're going to have them do a shape hunt. That's what we're going to do in just a second with your tracing paper. I went ahead and did mine in advance, and I traced part of the bluebonnet. I'll explain why this has graphite in the back in a minute. So a really obvious shape, but then I also traced things that were a little less obvious. The edge of my daughter's dress, my son's shirt, somewhere in there, here we go. I traced her jewels. These are the buttons on my son's shirt. And so then in the end, what you end up with is you have lots of assets of shapes that are big, medium, small, different styles and forms. And the idea with the trace and transfer is that, like, yes, I could draw circles by myself, but I don't know that I would draw them as ellipses. I don't know that I would draw them in this kind of fashion together, and that's some fun stuff that we can work with. Okay, so then that's your next step. You pick your pictures, then you're going to do some trace and transfer shape hunting. And then in the classroom, we would go on and start to do compositional studies based on those shapes. I will provide this list to you. And basically what I have here is I call these implication statements. These can totally be argued. They're not set in stone by any means, but they're things like smooth, flat, horizontal shapes give a sense of stability and calm. Vertical shapes are more exciting and active. Things like that. One of them says something like, if you put it at the bottom, it'll feel sad. If you put it at the top, it'll feel happy. But it forces, or it encourages your students to think about their composition and where they put the things, the assets within the picture plane, and that has influence over the viewer. So I will time these steps for you. But we are going to make a series of compositional studies or thumbnails. My students would do this for a long time before we even started. I only have 4, but we would be doing probably 12 to 16 of these, and they would be based on these statements. So for instance, this one says verticals are exciting and active. Rounded shapes are comfy and secure. I notice contrast with broken pattern. Diagonals create motion and tension. And I was thinking about the blue bonnet, my son's shirt, the buttons, the ruffle on my daughter's dress, the little jewels on her dress. But notice in these compositional studies that I made them very quickly. I wasn't trying to really draw the blue bonnets. I was really just thinking about where and how are things going to sit within the picture plane. I could try one that said the lower half of the composition feels more threatening and heavy or sadder, more constrained. So I could see what would happen. Again, I'm not really working too hard to make it look like blue bonnets. It's just literally a kind of quick sketch. And then maybe I'll let these kind of push me around and say what would happen if I also used horizontals to ground it even more, and some vertical with pattern that is broken. So things like this, like I can just try lots of them. So I'll put a timer on this for you guys. Hopefully you get at least 4 done, but just a couple is good. Once we have our compositional studies done, I would have the students spend a lot of time looking at examples of whatever material we were going to be rendering our designs with. So for this exercise, like I said, we're using these kind of kitchen items, like a gel pen or Sharpies. We, in the classroom, would be using microns, Faber-Castells, paint markers, big Sharpie markers that are paint markers, things like this. And I would show tons of examples, which I will show you guys on here in a minute outside of the video. And we would do some mark making experiments to see how, once we have our design, how we might go in and render it. So this hand-drawn wiggly line, so like I could come in and say, what would happen if I decide to try some hand-drawn wiggly lines. And so forth. So you can just test things out as it goes. Okay, so then when we have all that brainstorming done, that visual thinking, we go on to make the finished product. In my classroom, we often use mixed media board because it's 184 pound and it takes all kinds of materials. While we're using markers and such, my class then does push into painting later, and it's just a nice surface and a fun size. And we do tons of iterations first, and we often do them small because they're less stressful. So we had these trace and transfers, these tracings that we were able to make these from. So I'm going to show you very quickly how that unfolds. I took my drawing, my tracing, I turned it over, and I used a 4B graphite pencil. You could use a 6B, an 8B. H's might be challenging, but you can see that I'm going in and creating pigment over the drawing, so that then I've basically made a lo-fi transfer paper. You can get carbon paper like this, like at the art supply store or the craft store, but this you can do with vine charcoal or graphite, and then it allows you to go in and make some tracings. Oh, I'm going to switch to a mechanical pencil or an H pencil so that it's sharp while I'm transferring. I might clean this back up with my my eraser later. Or I mean with my ruler. Oh, it didn't release. I went the wrong way. Haha. Put it here. So you flip it over and then trace. Lesson learned. Let's check and see if it's releasing. Yes. You can tape it down. And then you're starting to build your designs. So again, I can show you with the blue bonnet, like so. So you can see it release. So then we end up with a bunch of these. Due to our time frame online today, we're not going to do this many, but I think having students work through lots of iterations gives them the chance to not feel like they're going to fail because they've got multiple things to look through. You'll notice in this one that I didn't really like it right in the middle, so I moved them where I did one here, and then I flipped it and I traced one there, and then I started to add the verticals, and I could keep working in with the verticals. Here's my diagonal one. We use a lot of tracing things in my class, so we could see what happens if I use a circle tracer. And how we can push those designs, again, based on those implication statements. Once we've completed these, then we go back to our mark making studies, or we go back to our sketchbook, excuse me, and look at our mark making studies to see how maybe we want to render one of these, or all of these. We're just going to do one today, or if you're fast, you can do more than that. I'm going to use a gel pen. And I can see what happens if I just do a sturdy line. I talk to my students a lot about owning your mark making and being really careful with your craft, and that some people have a really architectural mark that comes out of them, and some of them have a mark that looks like mine, that looks like I drank a lot of coffee. And just as long as you make it look like you meant it, that's okay. So if it's jumpy and there's something that's not working very well, maybe you can hide it or distract from it by using another mark around it, and so forth. So you would work through these with your students, trying different things, testing what would happen, you know, if you went in and made a portion of it darker. I get away with get carried away coloring. And so on and so forth. So we would build these out, and then once you have the smaller iterations that don't take very long, then we would shift to making a resolved final work. So something more like this that I could still keep building upon. I might copy one of these exactly. I might shift it and change it as I go based on parts of the different ones, and go from there. So we are going to try home now, and I'll give you some timings that we'll work through. Okay, here we go. Can't wait to see what you make.